The cold bites deep into London that January morning. A pale sun struggles through the mist, casting a ghostly light upon the scaffold at Whitehall. Draped in black, it looms like a gallows-shaped altar, built not for justice but for sacrifice. Beneath it, the crowd gathers. Tens of thousands press together, their breath rising in clouds, their silence heavy, unnatural. They do not cheer. They do not jeer. They wait. Upon that stage, history itself holds its breath. From the banqueting house, a figure emerges, cloaked in white against the darkness of timber and cloth. Charles Stuart, King of England, walks with measured steps, as if every footfall is an act of defiance. His eyes, calm and steady, meet the gaze of his executioners. The blade above him gleams in the weak light, a cold promise of finality. This is no ordinary execution. It is the death of a monarch, a man believed to rule by divine right, a man once untouchable no longer. With a single stroke, the axe will sever not only flesh and bone, but the sacred bond between crown and people. The world watches as the age of kingship trembles on the brink of ruin. A king is about to lose his head, and with it the very idea of sacred monarchy. Yet this is only the first chapter of a darker tale. For the English Civil War did not merely spill blood on the battlefield. It unleashed a theater of cruelty, a catalogue of punishments so brutal they were designed not just to kill, but to haunt. In the next 10 minutes, we will uncover the most brutal executions of that age. From kings and generals who defied their fate, to common men whose bodies were broken to terrify the living. But before we step deeper into this shadowed history, subscribe to Echoes of Time if you seek history's darkest truths. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read every single one. The courtroom was no place for kings, yet in January of 1649, Charles Stuart found himself seated before men who dared to call themselves his judges. They accused him of treason, of waging war against his own people. Never before had a reigning monarch been summoned to answer such charges. Not in England, not in Europe. For centuries, the crown had stood above the law. Now the law was sharpened into a blade pointed at the crown itself. The hall was silent as he entered, his presence still commanding despite the chains of circumstance. His words rang with defiance, denying the court's authority, insisting that no earthly power could sit in judgment over a king. Yet his voice, once carried by divine right, now echoed in a chamber where the tide had already turned. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty of tyranny, guilty of betrayal, guilty of crimes against the very nation he claimed to rule. And so the sentence was death. On the morning of January 30th, the banqueting house at Whitehall became a theater of doom. The scaffold, draped in mourning cloth, waited like a predator at rest. The crowd that gathered did not cheer. They did not call for mercy. They stood in silence, as if unsure whether the earth itself might shatter at what they were about to see. Charles walked forward with measured steps, clothed in white against the black timber of the stage. He removed his cloak, handed his last words to the bishop at his side, and declared that he died the faithful servant of God. Then, laying his head upon the block, he stretched out his hands, the signal to strike. The axe fell swift and clean. A gasp tore through the silence. Not a shout, but the sound of a nation recoiling from the unimaginable. A king's blood steamed against the frozen air, and with it, centuries of belief dissolved into nothing. The monarchy was no longer untouchable. The sacred had been made mortal. The political earthquake was instant. Across England, Europe, and the wider world, the unthinkable had happened. A king judged and executed by his own people. For some, it was justice long overdue. For others, it was blasphemy, a crime against heaven itself. But for all, it was terror, proof that no one, not even God's anointed, was safe from the blade. Would you have stood in the crowd that day, or turned away? Comment below. I'm curious how you'd react. The fall of a king did not satisfy the hunger for vengeance. The new regime, having dared to spill royal blood, turned punishment itself into a weapon of fear. To be branded a traitor in those years was not simply to face death. It was to face a death so elaborate, so calculated, that it transformed the body into a warning. The sentence was known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. Few punishments in history have rivaled it for cruelty. The condemned man was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the filth of the streets, jeered at by crowds, pulled to the gallows as if already half dead. There he was hanged, but not until death. No, the rope was cut short, leaving him gasping, twitching, choking back life that refused to leave. Then came the knife. Before the eyes of the crowd, the belly was opened. Entrails were pulled out and burned, the heart cut from the chest and raised aloft, as the executioner cried out that the traitor's heart belonged to no king, no country, no God. The body, broken but not yet finished, was then cut apart. Limbs severed, head removed, each fragment destined for public display. These grisly remains became trophies of authority. Heads were boiled in pitch to preserve them, then fixed to iron spikes above city gates. London Bridge became a forest of the dead, faces of the executed staring endlessly at those who passed beneath. Arms and legs were nailed to the walls of towns, where they rotted slowly in wind and rain, a reminder to all who looked that betrayal was more than death. It was annihilation. Among the first to suffer were royalist plotters and sympathizers who had tried to avenge their fallen king. Later, some of the very men who signed Charles's death warrant were themselves dragged to the gallows, their own fate echoing the terror they once commanded. The cycle was merciless, and the theater of execution became as important as the battlefield. This was justice turned into spectacle, law transformed into ritual horror. It was not enough to silence enemies. Their destruction had to be carved into the memory of every man, woman, and child who saw the remains. Terror was not a byproduct, it was the point. If you're new here, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you won't, at least tell me why in the comments. I want to hear your reasons. When the axe fell on Charles, power passed into the hands of men who believed they were instruments of God. At their head stood Oliver Cromwell, soldier, statesman, and the iron fist of the new republic. His armies carried not only muskets and steel, but a conviction that their cause was holy, that every enemy slain was an offering laid upon the altar of divine justice. In the autumn of 1649, Cromwell crossed the sea to Ireland. His campaign began at Drogheda, a fortified town that resisted his advance. For days, cannons thundered against the walls, until the gates splintered and his soldiers poured inside. What followed was not war, but slaughter. Soldiers who had thrown down their weapons were cut down where they stood. Civilians who fled into churches found no refuge. The sacred ground became a killing floor. Even priests, dragged from the altars, were put to the sword. The town ran red, its cries silenced beneath the hymn of musket fire. Cromwell called it the judgment of God, a punishment for rebellion and sin. But to those who survived, it was nothing less than butchery. The name Drogheda became a scar upon memory, whispered as a warning of what awaited those who defied him. From Drogheda his fury marched to Wexford. Once again, the pattern repeated. Walls shattered, streets consumed in chaos, inhabitants cut down without mercy. The executions were not limited to soldiers alone. Merchants, sailors, and townsfolk were swept into the tide of blood. Wealth was plundered, homes were burned, and survivors were left to carry the memory of horror into generations yet unborn. For Cromwell, these acts were proclamations, demonstrations of irresistible power. He told his followers that God himself had delivered judgment through their blades. Yet history would not remember these moments as divine. They became atrocities, engraved into the soul of Ireland as wounds that never healed. Centuries later, the shadow of Drogheda and Wexford still lingers, shaping bitterness, suspicion, and the uneasy ties between England and Ireland. These executions were not just the destruction of bodies, they were the creation of ghosts, haunting politics and memory for ages to come. Are you watching this from Ireland or the UK? Drop it in the comments. I want to see where Echoes of Time reaches. The brutality of the Civil War did not belong only to kings and commanders. Its shadow stretched down into the ranks of ordinary men, soldiers who marched for a cause, but found their reward at the end of a rope. Across the shattered countryside, fields that once carried banners now bore gallows. When armies clashed, The defeated often faced not imprisonment but execution. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, were hanged together, their bodies swinging in the wind like warnings stitched into the sky. Captured royalist officers were singled out, made examples before their men. Their deaths were staged with ceremony, reminding survivors that loyalty to a lost king could end in strangled silence. But it was not only the defeated monarchists who paid the price. Parliament's own troops, hardened veterans of campaigns, sometimes turned against their masters. Mutineers who demanded higher pay or resisted orders found themselves condemned as traitors. They had fought for a cause that now branded them as enemies. The noose tightened on necks that once served faithfully. And then there were the spies, the informers, the shadows who slipped between armies. Their lives were wagers placed on betrayal, and when discovered, they paid in the most public fashion. Town squares became their graves. The crowd watched as men accused of treachery were dragged out, their bodies broken to send a message that betrayal was poison, and poison would be purged with death. For soldiers, spies, and commoners alike, the Civil War revealed a truth more terrifying than battle: that the war could follow you even in surrender, even in loyalty. The line between service and betrayal was so thin that no one was safe. The executioner's rope did not ask if a man was noble or humble. It tightened with the same merciless grip. What do you think hurts more, dying for loyalty or dying for betrayal? Tell me below, and if you're not subscribing, at least share your thoughts. It sparks amazing debates here. When the monarchy returned in 1660, it came not with forgiveness, but with vengeance sharpened like steel. Charles II, son of the beheaded king, rode into London amidst the cheers of a people weary of war. Yet beneath the triumph lay a hunger for retribution. The men who had signed his father's death warrant, the regicides, became prey, hunted across England and beyond its shores. Some fled, hiding in foreign lands. Others were betrayed by neighbors or dragged from cellars where they thought themselves safe. But capture was not enough. The crown demanded blood, and the sentences carried echoes of the past. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. The very punishment they had once used to enforce their rule now awaited them in turn. Thomas Harrison, one of the first to face the scaffold, walked with a strange calm. He proclaimed his faith even as the rope slipped around his neck. The crowd roared as his body jerked, cut down before death could claim him fully. The executioner opened him wide, tearing out his heart, raising it aloft as the mob jeered. His body was cut into quarters, his remains scattered across the realm. Others followed. Men who once sat in judgment over a king now stood stripped and broken before a howling mass. Each scream of agony was swallowed by laughter. Each severed limb displayed like a trophy of restored power. Heads were set upon spikes at Westminster, their dead eyes gazing down on the streets where life continued as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. The monarchy, once humbled, had returned with fire in its veins. Those who had thought to build a nation without kings were erased in the most public, most brutal fashion. The cycle was complete. Terror no longer wore the face of revolution. It wore the crown. But vengeance did not stop with the living. In 1661, the crown turned its fury upon the dead. Oliver Cromwell, the man who had ruled England as Lord Protector, lay buried in Westminster Abbey, entombed with the honors of a head of state. Yet to the restored monarchy, his grave was not a resting place. It was an insult, a reminder that a usurper had once dared to govern in a king's stead. By royal command, his body was exhumed. The coffin was torn open, and the remains of Cromwell, along with those of his allies Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, were dragged from sacred ground. Their corpses, long since cold, were stripped of dignity and paraded through the streets like criminals. At Tyburn, where traitors met their end, the spectacle unfolded. The bodies were hanged on the public gallows, swaying grotesquely in the winter air. No breath filled their lungs, no cries escaped their mouths. But still the crowd gathered, still the ritual was performed. For this was not execution in the literal sense. It was theater, vengeance acting itself out upon corpses, as though death itself could be punished. When the mock hangings were complete, the executioner's blade came down. Heads were severed from rotting necks, lifted high before the crowd as if life still lingered in the skulls. Cromwell's head, blackened and shriveled, was mounted upon a spike at Westminster Hall, displayed above the very place where kings once passed. There it remained for decades, a grim totem of restored monarchy, staring down upon London with hollow eyes. This was more than cruelty. It was symbolism weaponized. By desecrating Cromwell's corpse, the monarchy sought to erase his legacy, to prove that even in death, their enemies could not escape humiliation. It turned the body of a ruler into a warning, a spectacle of macabre theater that blurred the line between justice and ritual horror. In the end, Cromwell was destroyed not once but twice, first in life and then in the grave. His second death was not for him, but for the living who looked upon his skull and understood the message. The crown had returned, and it demanded reverence, even from the dead. The Civil War left behind more than scars on battlefields. Its true legacy was written in blood upon the scaffold and in the shadows cast by severed heads. These executions were not born of justice. They were performances, carefully staged to terrify and to rule. Every stroke of the axe, every body dragged to the gallows, every heart torn from a chest was a declaration. Power was not argued, it was displayed in horror. The people of England learned that law itself could be twisted into a weapon, that the crown, parliament, and armies alike could cloak vengeance in the language of righteousness. Brutality became the language of politics, and terror the theater through which authority spoke. Generations carried the memory, the silence of the crowd at Whitehall, the smoke rising from the entrails of the condemned, the shriveled skull of Cromwell glaring down from its spike. These images did not fade. They shaped how England thought of monarchy, of rebellion, of justice itself. To challenge the order was to risk not only death, but annihilation, body and memory erased and mocked before the world. The Civil War was fought with swords and muskets, but it was won, and remembered, with executions. The axe that struck down Charles I did more than kill a king. It shattered the myth of divine rule. The mutilated corpses of regicides, the butcheries at Drogheda and Wexford, the desecrated remains of Cromwell, all of them stitched together into a single truth, that power is cruel and cruelty endures. From the fall of a king to the grim display of a skull, the story comes full circle. A nation remade through spectacle, a legacy carved into flesh and bone. These stories echo across time, and that's what we do here. Subscribe to Echoes of Time for more forgotten chapters of history. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you won't subscribe, at least join the comments and tell me why.